Hello, everyone. Welcome to Finance Friday at the Ayn Rand Center, UK. I'm Hard Money Jim speaking today from beautiful Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where it's finally springtime. Here in the Rockies, the air is clear and the tourists have not yet arrived, so it's kind of a special time around here. The title and theme of today's conversation is Inflation is much more than rising prices. Now, rising consumer prices, which most people take as synonymous with inflation, rising consumer prices are only the tip of the inflation iceberg, so to speak. There's much more lurking underneath. And to take another analogy, you can take the shark fin in this cartoon here above the water to be consumer prices, but the huge menace below the surface is all the other problems associated with inflation, and that's what we want to discuss today. Now, as you know, I try to study money creation and its consequences, and that means all the consequences, not just price increases. So as we'll see today, while excess money creation does cause consumer prices to rise, that is only part of what happens during a monetary expansion like the one we've had for the last dozen years or so. There are many other adverse economic effects of excess money creation, as we're going to see today. So to better understand the effects of inflation today, I need to do two things. First, I want to properly define the word inflation, including a short discussion of why a bad definition of such an important concept leads to inaccurate thinking and poor economic and political solutions. And then second, after we've arrived at a better understanding of inflation based on proper definitions, I'd like to take a tour through some, not all, but some of the major economic consequences associated with inflation. And we'll see that the problems are much deeper than a rise in consumer prices, bad and inconvenient though they may be. Okay, so to begin, the Fed's, that's the definition of inflation. This is a graph here of the Fed's measure of inflation, what they use to measure it. It's called the Personal Consumption Expenditure Deflator, the PCE. The Fed and most other economists, even many economists who are friendly toward capitalism, define inflation as an increase in consumer prices. Fed governors, including Chair Powell, they speak incessantly of the desired 2% inflation rate, by which they mean an annual increase in consumer prices, as measured by this index. Now, by the way, this allegedly ideal 2% annual increase they talk about means that over a 20-year period, you would lose 33% of your purchasing power of your money. That's what they think is the best thing for you, to decrease the purchasing power of your money by 33% over 20 years. That's also what they sometimes call, quote, no inflation. Now you can go figure out, if you can, why anybody would think that that's a good definition of inflation, or that's a good policy, a 2% depreciation of your money. But anyway, to say that a 2% annual increase in prices is the same as no inflation is obviously inaccurate. But the much bigger error is the misconception that inflation is only about consumer price increases. This poor understanding leads to many other errors, including a lack of understanding about what to do about inflation. So the meaning of words is important, and I'd like to illustrate that, if it works, by this little clip from everyone's favorite movie, The Princess Bride. I hope you hear this, but let's take a shot. You keep using that word, he said. I do not think it means what you think it means. And the Fed keeps using that word inflation. I do not think it means what they think it means. So, what exactly is inflation then? What does it mean what the Fed thinks it means? What's the best way? What's the most useful way and the most informative way to think about inflation? Let's just start off by trying to define inflation properly. And to do that, I went to a good dictionary, my own Oxford English Dictionary, 2002 edition, which defines inflation as, quote, an undue increase in the quantity of money circulating in relation to the goods available for purchase. Now, that's not a bad start, but the word undue is kind of imprecise. I mean, undue could mean just too much, or it could mean possibly unjust. But my own belief is that the quantity of money should be determined by a free market, which means that if the free market increases the quantity of money, then that increase is appropriate. So similarly, if the market demands less money, then that too determines the proper quantity of money. Exactly how we should secure a fully free market monetary system is well beyond the scope of today's discussion, but here I just want to assert that if the free market were allowed to function, there would be essentially no permanent inflation in the system. And since serious inflation can only be caused by government influence on the money creation process, I'm going to formulate the definition of inflation as follows. I say inflation is an undue increase in the quantity of money caused by government policy or action. And this is, by the way, also George Reisman's definition, or very close to it, which he does fully justify and fully develop. And for details, I would urge you to see his work in Capitalism, his book, Capitalism. Now, if we simply say inflation is an increase in consumer prices, this could mean any increase in consumer prices from whatever cause. But I say inflation is an undue increase in the money supply if I define it that way, and then show that this increase in money causes not only a rise in consumer prices, but also a rise in other prices like asset prices and commodity prices, as well as a whole host of other non-price related undesirable economic effects. Then we'd be much better prepared with that definition to understand all the consequences of excess money creation. So we just need a better definition to improve our understanding of all the economic consequences associated with inflation. Now to illustrate this, suppose after a hurricane, prices go way up, as they often do. Would that be called inflation, or is it just a price rise caused by temporary supply and demand disruptions? Or take today, where Joe Biden, repeatedly blames our high prices on the disruption of oil supplies due to the Ukraine war. He calls this Putin's inflation. That's his term. But if you can conflate the rising price of a specific commodity with inflation, you are obscuring the cause of the general all-encompassing price rise that was well underway long before the Ukraine war even started. That cause was excessive money creation. So this is how a bad definition obscures the truth and enables our politicians and bureaucrats to blame, for example, Vladimir Putin for the inflation we are in. And it allows the president and other government officials to evade responsibility for their actions. It's very much like the dog ate my homework excuse shown in this little cartoon here. It's very lame. It's very lame, but some people still buy into it. Now, a bad definition of inflation also leads to other confusions. Take the use of the term deflation, which is the opposite of inflation. For the past 30 or so years, maybe more, we've had a surge in productivity due to international trade, cheap foreign labor, and rapid technological progress. Those developments have brought lots of plentiful new beneficial products to all of us very cheaply. This is a remarkable surge in productivity, and the increased supply of goods has brought down prices or prevented price increases from being higher than they otherwise would have been. But so many economists say these resulting everyday low prices are, quote, deflationary. They really say this. To them, low prices due to technological progress are therefore due to deflation. That would mean technological progress is deflationary. And as I mentioned, many economists actually say this. But is that the right term to use? Now, we normally associate deflation with bad things like economic contraction, declines in commodity prices, economic bust, after an inflationary boom, high unemployment, decreasing production, increasing poverty, widespread bankruptcy. Is all that the same thing as everyday low prices due to increased productivity? It's clearly not. So it's completely wrong to say technology is deflationary, because it confuses a very good thing, that is progress, with a very bad thing, which is poverty. So clearly, if you accept that inflation is just rising prices from any cause, then you also must accept that its opposite, deflation, is lower prices from any cause. And of course, that's just nonsense. So clearly, the definition of inflation needs to include a reference to the cause of all the economic problems we associate with inflation. So to repeat and emphasize, I think a pretty good working definition is inflation is an excessive or undue increase in the quantity of money caused by government policy. Okay, so that was kind of a long introduction to the proper definition of inflation, but I think it was necessary. So before we go to the meat of today's discussion, let's pause for any questions or super chat. Daniel, I don't see anything on the screen. Is there anything I need to consider before I go on?
No, we have no super chat so far.
Okay, good. Let's roll. All right, with that definition problem out of the way, let's get to the meat of today's discussion. What are some of the bigger and broader economic problems other than high consumer prices that we associate with inflation? When we define it as an undue increase in the quantity of money. Now, I want to now mention a number of economic issues, but as a general statement, I want to say all or nearly all of the problems of inflation emanate from the inability to use stable prices to plan for the future. One of the main problems is that government inflation of the money stock sends false pricing signals to everyone. Inflation of the money supply distorts prices in such a way that economic calculation or economic planning becomes difficult or nearly impossible. And this problem affects everyone, from the simplest wage earner to the greatest financial tycoon. Misleading price signals cause people to miscalculate, and their economic plans almost fail. As we look into these examples, I want to emphasize, please keep something very important in mind. Any surge of new money into the economy never affects everyone at the same time or to the same extent. When new money is created, someone or some group always gets the new money first. The first receivers of the money have new claims to wealth, and they get the most benefit from those claims. This general idea that the first recipient of the new money gets the greatest advantage was first formally analyzed by an early French-Irish economist named Cantillon, pictured here, Richard Cantillon. And this is sometimes called the Cantillon effect. Now just think, if all prices and wages went up at the same time by the same amount, would there actually be a problem? If it were true that an injection of new money into the economy caused all wages and prices and all costs to rise at a uniform rate, everyone could just simply adjust. So if everyone's cash flow went up 10% at the same time, we'd all make 10% more money, and the price of everything we spent our money on would rise 10%, and there would be relatively few problems. Business would just mark up their projections of both revenues and costs by 10%, and they'd proceed with their planning. What could be easier than that? But that's not how money creation works. The first recipients of the new money are in a position to bid up prices of the things they want to buy. They outcompete those who did not get the new money. The new money then spreads through successive spending to the second and third and fourth order recipients, disrupting the entire pricing structure. It signals outsized demand for the goods bought at the front end of the process and insufficient demand at the back end of the process. This throws the entire structure of economic production into disarray, and the bigger the inflation, the worse the disarray. So now I just want to mention some representative examples of this overarching problem. This isn't by no means going to be an exhaustive list, but it's going to illustrate the sort of the breadth of the inflation problem and point out that inflation problems show up in unexpected places. I'm going to use three sort of classifications of examples here as I go through this. And these are all things I've written about. So the first is how inflation increases the nominal profits of business, and not in a good way. The second will be how inflation increases asset prices and lowers real interest rates. And the third will be how inflation creates an illusion of wealth, which undermines rational economic behavior. So first example, few people understand that inflation raises the nominal profits of business in the aggregate. Let's see if I have a slide for this. I think I might. Yeah. To see how an inflating money supply and fake profits, as I call them, are related, we first must understand that the timing relationship between costs and sales. In most cases, a company must invest capital and labor upfront to produce something of value before selling the product. That's the nature of the productive process. It just happens through time. With very few exceptions, the outlay of money for future production precedes the sale of the thing being produced. Now, next, we need to know the effect on prices when new money is injected into the economy. When new money enters the economy, the people who receive it spend some or all of it, and then it's respent again and again, raising the overall level of spending as it spreads through the economy. Everything else equal, prices are going to be higher after the introduction of new money than before the new money came into existence. So this principle is kind of a simple expression of the quantity theory of money, which says that the general level of demand depends mainly on the quantity of money available. All else equal, the larger the amount of money injected into the economy, the higher prices will rise. And we saw this in spades during the pandemic stimulus of 2022. And therefore, during a highly inflationary period like the one we are in, the general price level is going to increase between the time a company spends cash for production and the time when it sells its products. Inevitably, those elevated prices will amplify nominal profits. In the case of the big pandemic stimulus that we just had, lots of new money was given to consumers and companies after they had already spent money for inventory or labor at lower prices. When these new higher prices matched against their historically lower costs were higher than they would have been without the stimulus. So profit, which is of course the difference between revenue and cost, increased. Now, I am not boasting at all. I wrote about this. I never saw anyone else write about this. This graph shows US corporate profits surging to an all-time high during a time of lockdowns, a pandemic, and a crippled economy. How could that be? Record profits during a crippled economy. The increase is all phony. It's all inflation. These are illusory profits. And that's why I sometimes say they are, quote, fake. As I say, I wrote about this in a Substack article on December 17th, 2021. And you can read the details there if you want. This article that I wrote also includes examples of how all these profits, this is important, all these profits could be eaten up by taxes and higher replacement costs, actually leaving the seller worse off than he was before the inflation, even though at first glance he might think he's doing well. All right. Okay, second example of how, sort of second order effects, I guess, of money supply increase. And that is inflation increases asset prices and lowers interest rates. Now, this is a big issue. High asset prices and low interest rates have defined our economy for the last 10 to 12 years, and they're mostly due to the excess money created by the actions of the Fed. I've written a lot about how money creation during the QE era from 2010 to 2022 fueled a bubble in the stock market. Two essays address this, one on September 20th and another on October 12th, 2021. This graph here shows that relationship. The black line is M2, a measure of the quantity of broad money. And you can see it was already rising pretty briskly from 2010 to 2020, but then it went almost vertical during the pandemic QE program. As you will recall, this new money was created by the banking system with sort of, with critical assistance from the Fed. What happened was the banks bought treasuries and mortgage-backed bonds, paying for them with new made-up money, and then the Fed almost immediately and sometimes simultaneously bought these bonds from the banks. That created additional demand for the bonds that lowered the market interest rates. And in most cases, the bank purchases and Fed purchases that, like I said, were done simultaneously, creating both new money to be spent in the economy and new bank reserves on the balance sheet of the bank. That's the essence of QE. That's it. The sellers of the bonds, though, got the new cash, the new money, and they invested their new money in more bonds and into stocks, pumping up these prices. And that's stock prices that you see shown in red. As you see, their price rise matches the increase in money supply, and this is not a coincidence. This is straightforward inflation, but it's inflation of asset prices instead of consumer prices. The radically increased demand for money, from money creation, I should say, pumped up stock prices, plain and simple. But if you think inflation is only consumer prices, you would not associate this asset price bubble with inflation, which I think it clearly was. Okay, so other asset prices went up as well. Let's go forward here. You've already seen how house prices have zoomed up during pandemic QE. We've talked about that. They're up like 20 or 30% in the last couple of years. This is a chart that shows the percentage of US home sales in which sales prices exceeded the listed asking price. I really like this chart because it reveals several things. First, it implies how rapidly prices rose in the face of money printing. And secondly, it illustrates how inflation disrupts economic calculation. Again, look at this. This is percentage of US homes sold above their official listing price. And note that that percentage was pretty stable, around 20, 25% before the big pandemic stimulus program. But now, over 50% of homes are being sold at a price greater than the listed asking price. This tells me that the brokers and realtors cannot get their heads around the abrupt change in demand. If they did understand their market, you should see about 20% of homes selling above list price, as it used to be pre-pandemic. But prices have risen so fast that the brokers are systematically listing their clients' homes at too low a price. Inflation causes these kinds of miscalculations, and this is a visible example of it. Now, a few weeks ago, a Wall Street Journal article pointed out that between March 2021 and March 2022, the average house in the USA appreciated by $58,000 in 1 year. compared to the average annual household income of about $51,000. So the average homeowner made more on his house just living in it in 1 year than the average householder earned in 1 year. How does price movement of that magnitude skew or influence people's behavior? You can guess, you can imagine, you can tell me. And I just finished a trip across the Midwest to attend a graduation, and everywhere Kathy and I went, people were talking about real estate prices. And several times, at rest stops, I overheard people saying, "I couldn't believe what they were willing to pay me for my house. So we just sold and hit the road, bought this RV, and here we are traveling." That was pretty common. That kind of calculation may work for some people, but it is at least in part not real wealth, but an illusion of wealth, which I'm going to talk about a little more shortly. Let us see. Daniel, I cannot read that super chat. Is there something on there I should address?
It's a super chat from Bonnie. Thank you. And it's just it's called sticker, so it's like a skyline of the city.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you, Bonnie. All right, now let's move on here. Look at other effects that we've had. This is an effect of both money printing and the Fed's reaction to it. So let's look now at the flip side of that home price appreciation, along with the Fed's interest rate policy of rising rates. And you can see that the combination of higher interest rates and higher home prices has increased the cost of home ownership by 80%. That's like almost overnight. How do you plan a home purchase in the face of price and interest rate swings like this? And what will this do to the housing boom? I don't know. It's an example of, it's for sure an example of inflation undermining rational economic planning. If I were in the market for a home, this would give me pause. This would send chills up and down my spine. So we're talking about inflation raising asset prices and lowering interest rates. What were some of the other effects of this long-term trend during QE? One important effect that I've written about is the unjust redistribution of wealth. And this gets a lot of editorial comment. Some people on Wall Street actually made billions of dollars by doing very little more than front-running the Fed. And by that, I mean they were buying bonds knowing they could sell them later to the Fed at a higher price. I wrote about this in September and October 2021, the articles I mentioned previously. The September 2021 article was called Quantitative Easing, a Massive Giveaway to the Rich. The subtitle was, "But Don't Blame Wall Street or Capitalism." So I don't want to be misconstrued as thinking I'm against Wall Street. I'm not. I've made my living on Wall Street for decades. But what's gone on is pretty unfair and pretty scandalous. For about 12 years, from 2010 to 2022, the years of QE, the owners of assets, or those who managed or controlled assets such as stocks and bonds and real estate, saw huge increases in the dollar value of their holdings and their income. Those who held their wealth in dollars, though, just cash, were left behind. In my articles, I show that this giveaway to the rich was done on purpose. It was a deliberate inflation of asset prices that would enrich asset owners, under the belief that this so-called wealth effect would eventually trickle down and benefit everyone. Of course, that did not happen. Instead, once consumer prices kicked in, oh boy, it didn't come out well. This is what happened. I'm sorry about the resolution of this slide. I'll have to tell you what it says. Remember, we said that price increases did not hit everyone at the same time to the same extent. Some people lose more than others. The orange line here in the top graph is the trend of prices, and the blue line is the trend of wages, and the red at the bottom is the deficit between wages and prices. So as the graph shows, wage and salary increases are currently lagging well behind consumer price increases. So not only did the wage earning class not participate in the asset boom, They are now getting shellacked by higher consumer prices, and that's further exaggerating the unjust economic divide that was caused by the Fed. Now, just to mention one more hidden but serious problem resulting from inflation. And again, I don't know of anyone else who's written about this. In August of 2021, I wrote a piece called Unmasking Inflation, in which I pointed out that this consumer price index, the Fed's measure of inflation, does not cover many things we actually spend money on. Most importantly, it does not cover the cost of saving. That is, the cost of methodically putting money away for the future. The high cost of saving is sort of the flip side of high asset prices and low interest rates. Now, for example, as I pointed out in the article, if you're a middle-class professional earning $150,000 a year and you want to save enough to pay yourself a retirement income of $50,000 per year, say 30 years from now, the little tiny interest rates caused by the Fed's QE inflation program would actually triple your cost of saving for retirement. That example is summarized in this slide, and it's explained fully in the article if you want to check it out. In other words, at a normal historic interest rate, you would generate a $50,000 permanent income by saving about $1,250 a month, which would be, in this example, 10% of your income, for 30 years. And that would be investing at low risk. But with the little tiny interest rates caused by the Fed, you would have to save over 3 times as much per month. That is over 30% of your income to accomplish the same thing. Now, that's virtually impossible for the average person. But this very important element of everyday spending, the cost of saving for the future, is never counted by the Fed in their inflation estimates. They ignore it. So inflation made normal savings almost impossible. That problem does not figure into the Fed's definition. Now, I could say more about the distortions caused by inflated asset prices, but you get the idea. So let's move on. Another major important consequence of inflation, not directly related to consumer prices, is that inflation creates an illusion of wealth that subverts or undermines rational economic behavior. Now, many, and perhaps most people, seeing their house price go up, or their 401k up, or that their Bitcoin, account went way up, they think they're getting rich. But in many and perhaps most cases, this is an illusion. As the price of your assets goes up, ask yourself, are you better off in terms of real wealth? It's a mistake to confuse money with wealth, and inflation exaggerates this mistake. Wealth is the stuff, the material goods, the unused consumer goods, or the means of economic production that produce items of wealth. Now, that is wealth. It also includes less tangible things like, intellectual property and so forth. I acknowledge that. But for the most part, wealth is in material form. Now, money is what we exchange for these things. Money itself is useless, though, if there's no wealth to exchange for. If your house price went up by 50%, didn't other house prices also do the same? Did you, in fact, get any richer? So if you cash out, are you really better off? Because if you either exchange this cash, you will either exchange this cash for some other asset, some other inflated asset, or you hold it as cash. And if you just hold it as cash, you no longer have the house, and the value of your cash declines with inflation. So widespread, across the board kind of price appreciation, where all or nearly all prices are rising, is often creates this illusion of wealth. And this influences economic behavior. For example, the illusion of wealth causes people to borrow excessively. They think they're richer than they really are, so they think they can handle more and more debt. They overconsume relative to their real wealth. They think they can afford luxuries they never would have considered before the big inflation. And this illusion of wealth even contributes to supply chain problems. I wrote about this in a January 21 piece called The Broken Supply Chain and Excessive Money Creation. Is there a link? And I showed that contrary to the impression that goods were stacking up at the ports undelivered, the ports were actually moving more physical merchandise than ever before, but bottlenecks were developing because of the unprecedented demand that was caused in turn by too much money creation. So overall, the illusion of wealth makes people think they're richer because they have more money, which gives them more purchasing power. But their new money is not actually new purchasing power. Much of the new good fortune is fake. Some of it is purchasing power conferred on them at the expense of someone else, or at the expense of their own future indebtedness. Inflationary price signals can obscure all of this information. All right, so I'm going to give you a quote now from Henry Hazlitt to sort of sum up these points. He says, quote, "Inflation discourages prudence and thrift. It encourages squandering, gambling, and reckless waste of all kinds. It often seems more profitable to speculate than to produce. Inflation tears apart the whole fabric of stable economic relationships. Its inexcusable injustices drive men toward desperate remedies. It plants the seeds of fascism and communism. It leads men to demand totalitarian controls. It ends invariably in bitter disillusion and collapse." And even a mild inflation can distort the structure of production. As Henry Rand pointed out elsewhere, it leads to an overexpansion of some industries at the expense of others. And this involves a misapplication and waste of capital. When the inflation collapses or is brought to a halt, the misdirected capital investment, whether it's in the form of machines or factories or office buildings, cannot any longer yield an adequate return, and it loses the greater part of its value. That's what's happening, by the way, in the zombie companies that we talked about a few weeks ago. Now, I want to say a few words about one more non-price effect of inflation, namely its effect on the moral fiber of the culture. And here I want to quote from a source that I referred to before. It's from a 100-plus-year-old monograph called Fiat Money Inflation in France by Andrew Dixon White. Now, White wrote about the great inflation leading up to the French Revolution and how it changed the character of the people of the country. He first pointed out, White did, that the French citizens were naturally very thrifty people, but inflation changed that. This is quoting now. "The great majority of Frenchmen now became desperate optimists, declaring that inflation is prosperity. Throughout France, there came temporary good feeling. The nation was becoming inebriated with paper money. The good feeling was that of a drunkard just after his draft, and it is to be noted as a simple historical fact corresponding to a physiological fact that as drafts of paper money come faster, the successive periods of good feeling grow shorter." Quote, "Still another difficulty appeared. There had come a complete uncertainty as to the future. Long before the close of 1791, no one knew whether a piece of paper money representing 100 livres would, a month later, have a purchasing power of 90 or 80 or 60 livres. The result was that capitalists feared to embark their means in business. Enterprise received a mortal blow. Demand for labor was still further diminished, and here came a new cause of calamity. The business of France dwindled into a mere living from hand to mouth. This state of things, too, while it bore heavily upon the moneyed classes, was still more ruinous to those in moderate and most of all to those in straitened circumstances. With the masses of the people, the purchase of every article of supply became a speculation in which the professional speculator had an immense advantage over the ordinary buyer. Commerce was dead. Betting took its place. But, quote, further quoting, "But these evils, though great, were small compared to those far more deep-seated signs of disease which now showed themselves throughout the country. One of these was the obliteration of thrift from the minds of the French people. A loose luxury spread throughout the country. A still worse outgrowth was the increase in speculation and gambling. At the great metropolitan centers grew a luxurious speculative stock gambling body, which like a malignant tumor absorbed into itself the strength of the nation and sent out its cancerous fibers to the remotest hamlets. At these city centers, abundant wealth seemed to be piled up. In the country at large, there grew a great dislike of steady labor and a contempt for moderate gains and simple living. What a prospect for a country when its rural population was changed into a great band of gamblers. Now, if like me, you think some of that sounds familiar, if the shoe fits. Even worse, he goes on, was the breaking down of the morals of the country at large. He's summing up now, resulting from the sudden building up of ostentatious wealth in a few large cities and from the gambling, speculative spirit spreading from these to the small towns and rural districts. From this was developed an even more disgraceful result, the decay of a true sense of national good faith. I would say there's some element of this going on in our economy today. And I found this in Bloomberg. Inflation encourages gambling and speculation. Yep, if everything looks unpredictable, why not take a long shot? YOLO, as they say, you only live once. All right, now, as a final point, unfortunately, chronic inflation eventually encourages the government to intervene in prices because inflation gives interventionist politicians, like the one pictured here, cover to do something, quote, about rising prices. And usually they try to either implement price controls, for example, rent controls or wage controls, or rationing of some kind, like the gas lines of the 1970s. Both of those kinds of things will cause further damage and at least be partially circumvented by clever businessmen and consumers. So be on the lookout for these kinds of schemes, but know they will not work. And resilient business people, and perhaps you, will likely figure out how to overcome any such obstacles. And along that line, I want to close out here with a kind of an amusing story from the 1970s, which the 70s bear a lot of similarities to today. Now, this story is a tribute to the ingenuity of business and to the stupidity and futility of price controls. The setup for this story is that in the wake of the 1973 Arab oil embargo, oil prices in the USA shot sky high. And so naturally, government officials like Richard Nixon and Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld could not let oil producers have their temporary high profits, which would have been reinvested in badly needed new oil production. Instead, they slapped on complicated price controls on what they called old oil. Now, old oil was oil from a field that was purchased before the big rise in the oil price, and that was deemed to be too profitable. So its price was controlled at around $5 a barrel. But new oil, or oil extracted from a field bought after that price rise, was allowed to trade at the international market price, which was then around $10 a barrel. Now, I had a good friend from high school, best friend, football buddy. His name was Bobby. Unfortunately, he's now deceased. He became an oil field entrepreneur, independent operator, and he had both an oil field that he had owned for a while, an old one, and he had a new field that was under development. And so under these price controls, any oil from the new field would fetch a price much higher than the oil extracted from the old field. And his new wells in the new field need to be fractured, or they call it fracking now, to get the oil flowing. By the way, they did do fracking back there. Everyone says it's new, but it's been around since the 50s. Anyway, one method of doing this was to inject crude oil into the new well under pressure to break up the porous rock to make the new oil flow. So maybe you can see where this is going. My friend Bobby simply sold old oil from his old company to his new company at the low price. And then he injected this old oil into his new wells as a fracturing fluid. And then he extracted new oil, obviously now mixed with the old oil and indistinguishable from the new oil, and sold it all at the higher uncontrolled market price. So that's a nice way to turn old oil into new oil and a nice way to beat price controls. And after a few years of stuff like this, with various other arbitrage schemes going on, the government finally figured out that price controls were fruitless and scrapped them. So, I include this story because despite all the bad news about inflation, let not your hearts be troubled. Business and the economy are resilient. They'll find a way to survive. Even if we do get price controls, we'll figure out how to work and get around them. All right. I think I'm going to quit there. And I wonder if now we have any more. It's about pretty good timing. We have any questions or super chat issues at this point?
No questions.
Is there anybody out there? Just kidding. Okay, so just to close out here, you can find me on Substack. You can find me on Twitter, although I don't do much. And I'll have this recording out on Substack, and it'll be available on the ARC UK channel immediately after we close out here. So thank you very much. And everyone have a wonderful Memorial Day weekend. Be safe and be careful out there. Bye-bye.